Okay, so here we pick up on the second layer of the skin, the dermis. Right, so the dermis is quite a bit thicker. Here's a slide of skin, so you really get this perspective. So from these are papillae, which a papilla is always a bump, right? So from here to here is epidermis, and this is of course all this stratum corneum. It looks very flaky when after you run it, you section it and you stain it. It has this really strange appearance, but this is all stratum corneum. This of course is the stratum basale, and again epithelial, so it's cell, cell, cell. Here we get into the dermis, which is a lot of connective tissue, and this is basically dense irregular connective tissue, most of it, but we divide this into this papillary layer, which is that layer that comes up right and kind of projects into, in a sense, the epidermis, and then this reticular layer. All right, so loose areolar, its function is really to allow the blood vessels and some of the sensory stuff to be able to be positioned here, so it gives them kind of some space, some room. The dermal papillae are most evident in your palms of your hands and the soles, right, the plantar surface of your feet. And this is what really creates that ridging that you see and helps us with grip. So this, again, loose areolar dermal papillae is a gripping function for it to enhance, when you have contact. The cells you'd find here would be fibroblasts. All right, so here's again nuclei, fibroblasts, some fat cells, macrophages, because at this point, since there's blood here, now we are vulnerable, right? Because if a microbe does make it through here, or you cut yourself and you get down into here, you can access blood. So you need guardians on hand. There'll be lymph vessels in here with blood vessels, nerves. The most classic example of sensory, of course, are the Meissner's corpuscles, sometimes called the tactile corpuscles. Your reticular layer from here on down is really a dense, irregular connective tissue. So all this pink is really collagen, and a lot of these purple dots are fibroblasts, right? So we have a lot in here as well. All right, there's a lot of other nerves, a lot of free nerve endings, hair follicles, smooth muscle with glands. So again, that we said smooth muscle really helps to move things. So it surrounds the glands, sebaceous glands, sweat glands. More lymph and blood vessels would be here too. So pretty busy. All right, now the hypodermis is not technically the skin. All right, but it serves a very important role. Clearly, it helps connect the skin to the underlying muscle, right? And it provides a route for larger blood vessels. Fat allows tubes to move through it, so it's you tend to find a lot of blood vessels in fat because it gives, if you will, if you want to think of it that way. And it allows, again, allows, right? And it's also an insulation. Right? So it turns out that, this shell that is our skin can have a vastly different temperature than the core of the body. So this works really nicely. And I liken this to the idea of insulation in your house, right? You want to put that insulation up against the walls because the furnace, of course, is your muscle. Most of your body heat comes from muscle. So now this layer of adipose tissue that we call the subcutaneous layer helps to conserve that heat, right? Because most of the time, honestly, you are in environments that aren't 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius, right? Most of the time it's cooler, so you need a conservation. This cartoon also shows you, again, this perspective of very big dermis and significantly smaller epidermis, very, very busy layer, this dermis. Okay, so the skin rests on top of this, allows you to attach to the muscle beneath, the subcutaneous does. It's a pathway, as I say here, loose connective tissue. Half our fat stores are found here, so it gives us padding and insulation. All right, why do we have color? Well, this really comes from the epidermis predominantly, but not exclusively. All right, so let's take a look at this. Heredity, it means that, genetics. So you inherit the types of melanin made and how much melanin's made, the size of the granules, and that then indicates that what color you really have. There's a number of sets of genes that lead to these differences in us. So it's not just this easy, dominant, recessive, simple Mendelian genetics. It's actually sets of genes, and there's a range of color for humans. All right. Environment influences our color to some extent, and of course our physiological processes do. All right. So number one, right, in the skin, hair, and eye are these inherited proteins we call melanin. And there's just basically two types. There's a true melanin that's a black-brown color, and there's this pheomelanin, which is red. And again, so these cool cells called melanocytes, and again, they show this difference in the size of the granules and the types of melanin. Because the same cells here. In fact, we from what we understand, all of us have the same number of melanocytes in our skin, right? What differs, again, is the type of melanin and the size of these granules and so forth. Well, it turns out these really funky-looking cells, right, have these long processes that kind of go up through the layers, right? So this would be the stratum basale. Here's our dermis. And little pieces of this come off. So there's this really, and they are engulfed or, endocytosed by the nearby keratinocytes. And that's how it turns out that you can have, not a whole lot of melanocytes, but still have a very uniform color throughout your integument. So it just kind of spreads out its product. And of course, these cells keep moving up, so you get towards the top, and they'll start to die as well. But the color is preserved through this layer because of this process. Now, interesting enough, when you tan, and everyone knows that if you don't expose yourself to more sunlight, the tan will fade. Why does it fade? Well, because initially, when you've exposed yourself to sunlight, right, these melanocytes have increased their production of melanin, right, and they've darkened the skin, whether you're already dark or you are light to start with. Again, and if you're too light with less melanin, you might burn, right? You might damage it, because this melanin, this protein, is protective against UV. It absorbs UV light, right? So in trying to protect yourself when you expose yourself to sunlight, you produce more melanin, right? And so again, it distributes throughout here. Well, if you don't continue exposing yourself to UV radiation, the production by these cells, and it becomes more noticeable in light-skinned people, decreases. And so these vesicles that are now engulfed by the keratinocytes move up, you keep sloughing off skin, so eventually, right, your tan fades, right? So again, the function of this is really absorption of UV light and protection. The amount determines your color. Some regions of skin have more melanin, some have less. All right. Believe it or not, your lips actually have less. I know they look darker, but that's only because it's a very, very thin layer over muscle, and the muscle is what you see underneath there. All right. The bottoms of your feet, the palms of your hands also tend to have less melanin. They're not exposed to sunlight, right? It correlates with function. No surprise there, I hope. All right. I say again, while all people have about the same number of melanocytes, they vary in the amount of melanin, the type of melanin, distribution and size of the granules. And this, of course, is inherited and is somewhat complicated, which is why, again, we see a range of coloration in people. The other factors that contribute, besides genes, of course, is your environment. So how much sunlight are you exposed to? How much protection do you need? Hormones influence this. So estrogen, and there's a melanocyte-stimulating hormone made by the pituitary gland, can both cause a darkening in skin. All right. Regarding physiology, here is something to consider: is that your coloration of your skin is also dependent on how much blood flow you have to your skin, right? And this correlates with temperature. So when it's hotter outside, you increase the amount of blood, so blood perfusion to the integument. And this then makes a redder or pinker, if your skin's light enough, you can see this reddish color to it. And when it's cold, we appear lighter because less blood flow to the skin. And this is, again, to help control the loss of heat from the body. So when it's cold outside, you want to reduce this conduction and radiation, so less blood flow to the skin and a different color. There's also the degree of oxygenation. So people that do not have adequate oxygenation, usually for respiratory problems, but this can also be because of carbon monoxide poisoning, have a different coloration to their skin. All right. Then there's another compound chemical molecule called keratin, and keratin is found, it's a precursor to vitamin A, and it's found in many of your oranges and yellow vegetables or and fruits. And so this can alter coloration because vitamin A is actually stored in skin. It's a fat-soluble vitamin. It associates with fats and the waxes in your skin, so accumulates in the lipids that surround the stratum corneum. And this is there, it's a waxy substance to help us from losing water, right? It prevents dehydration, but it can result in a yellow coloration. All right, we're not going to Kahoot, all right? I hate to tell you that, right? But we want to do this as a class together, or you can look up my Kahoots, but either way, it's better for me to go ahead and present information to you guys rather than to quiz you at this point. All right, so skin, that's our basic epidermis, dermis that make up the skin. So what we want to focus on in this section is all the additional features that you find really in the dermis that help us with those functions. All right, so I say here, though, to be clear, many of these, and this is, we're talking about the hair, the glands, the nails, that these actually developmentally come from the epidermis, but they invade the dermis. So when you look at this, it's easy to tell this on the slide because it's like you're looking at all this pink collagen in the reticular layer of the dermis, and then all of a sudden there's these dark, like purple, all kinds of nuclei all together and really close. And you're there on a gland, and glands are typically epithelial tissue, right? We learned that in the last chapter. Or a hair. All right, so hair, we obsess a lot over this. It's not, it's not terribly important to humans. We consider ourselves hairless apes, right? And so it is, as mammals, we have it everywhere, technically, with a few exceptions, right? You don't typically see it on the palms of your feet and palms of your hands. It's not on your lips. It tends not to be on your nipples, parts of your genitalia. And believe it or not, the last segments of your fingers and toes, all right? So hair does have function. Again, it's just been significantly reduced in us, right? It's extremely sensory, right? It enhances our ability because the hair extending out there can be moved, and that movement then alerts our brain to something that's changing in our environment. It can be protective, not as much for us, but protective for, again, it's going to protect you from UV because it's covering the skin and the cells, and hair, again, outside of the follicle is dead, like your stratum corneum is dead. Again, we could call it helping us with preventing heat loss and communication, but these are really more other mammal things, honestly, right? Now, your hair grows in cycles. This is all italicized, so you're not going to have to know that. It's kind of interesting. It's these cycles and the name anagen and catagen and telogen, so your hair is generally constantly growing, right? We lose so many a day, and we, more erupt each day. So in the end, it doesn't look like anything changes, which is pretty cool to me. It's a mathematical, not miracle, but it's really amazing if you do the calculations. Like, whoa, you have this constant appearance while you are always losing and always growing hair. So the color we get in our hair is also from melanin, and these will be melanocytes in a papillae that we'll see in the follicle itself. And as I said before, the hair follicle develops from a group of epidermal cells that have invaded the dermis. All right. So here's a cartoon to look at this. The follicles, right? So here, as we look at the follicle collectively, there's as we're moving outwards, and certainly we get erupt from the scalp, we're dead. Okay. And we're dying. We're in the process of dying, right about here. Okay. So what we see inside, right, in the dermis, and this is all over the body. I focus a lot on the scalp, but the scalp is not the only place for hair, right? It's pretty much everywhere. So you have a hair root, right, with the keratinized cells. Again, keratin is very big for this. And the mitotically active basal cells in this place we call the matrix, all right? The papillae is a projection of these connective tissue and blood vessels that help nourish these really active cells. Dividing cells are pushed up, keratinized, and die. Right, so the hair shaft, we're in the process of dying here, as it erupts, it's dead. And this is very protective for us. There is this muscle associated called the erector pili, and these have sebaceous glands associated with them. Okay, So we want to think about that in the next video. What do they do for us?